That heavy, clunking sound of a Dreamcast disc drive is something you never forget. It didn't just sound like a console, it sounded like the future was finally arriving. I was always a PlayStation kid through and through, but Resident Evil Code Veronica was the one game that actually made me look at my PS1 and think it was starting to look a bit old. It was the entire reason I wanted the Dreamcast. After years of running through those flat static backgrounds in Raccoon City, seeing Claire Redfield in a fully 3D world with a camera that actually moved felt like a massive jump. It was like someone had finally turned the lights on. The scale of it felt huge at the same time. We'd spent 2 games wondering where Chris Redfield had gone, while Claire searched for him, and seeing them finally back together felt like a proper reward. Then you had Wesker coming back with those superhuman Matrix moves. Looking back now, it's a bit cheesy and very early 2000s, but as a 10-year-old, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. But this game was mean. It didn't just give you a challenge, it waited for you to mess up and then basically ruined your save file. We've all been there, getting to the tyrant fight on the plane with nothing but a couple of handgun bullets and a prayer, realising you're completely soft-locked. There was no hand-holding. If you didn't know that the game was going to swap you over to Chris halfway through and you left all your guns on Claire, you were basically finished. You had to learn the hard way. These days, I can breeze through the game with plenty of ammo and a stash of herbs, but that first time feeling of not knowing what was around the corner never really goes away. When Resident Evil Code Veronica X eventually came to the PS2, it felt a bit like Capcom was up to its old tricks. It was like the director's cut all over again, offering just enough new game stuff like the Devil May Cry demo to make you buy it. Even though it didn't add much to the actual game besides some extra cutscenes and a new haircut for Steve, even with the extra bits on the PS2, I still prefer playing it on the Dreamcast. There's just something about the beep of the VMU and seeing your health right there on the controller that feels right. It's a messy, difficult game with plenty of flaws, but that nostalgia of being 10 years old and seeing it for the first time is why it's still one of my favourites. It's probably the one game in the series that would benefit the most from a full remake.
Don't move.
We've officially hit a milestone with the PSX Index. Every Resident Evil game released for the original PlayStation has now been documented and tucked away into the archive. Those videos have always been some of the biggest hits on the channel, and honestly, it feels like there's still a lot of meat left on the bone. The mission to play 1,278 PS1 games is still the main goal, but Resident Evil is the series that defined that era for so many of us. It feels right to keep that momentum going and follow the story into the next generation. So while the index continues, these episodes are going to act as a series expansion. It's a way to bridge the gaps and build out a complete history of the franchise without being restricted by a single console's library. And if we're going to talk about where Resident Evil went after the Raccoon City trilogy, we have to talk about the game that felt like the next true step for the series. We're moving away from the grey box for a bit to look at Resident Evil Code Veronica. Whether you played the original on the Dreamcast or caught the X version later on the PlayStation 2 or GameCube, this was the game that promised to change the formula. It traded the static painted background of the 90s for a fully 3D world, and in doing so, it created one of the most atmospheric and punishing experiences in the entire franchise.
Dreamcast で進化、新たな恐怖が始まった。Biohazard Code Veronica.
One of the surviving members of RPG's famous STARS teams.
Dreamcast で実現した新しいバイオハザードの世界。そのリアルさ、演出、息を呑む臨場感、そして恐怖。バイオ2の事件より3ヶ月後、ヒロインクレアを中心に物語は新展開を迎える。絶海の孤島に捕らえられ、ゾンビの群れに囲まれ、 果たして生き残るチャンスは。全てが進化した次世代バイオハザード。君の心臓はついてくれるか。はい、飯。
When you first wash up on the shores for Rockfort Island, the shift in scale is immediate. In the older games, you always felt like you were moving through a series of dioramas. They were beautiful, but they were fixed. Code Veronica changed that. The camera actually tracked Claire as she moved, panning across the rain-soaked graveyard and tilting up to show the massive scale of the prison complex. It made the world feel less like a set of rooms and more like a real physical place you were trapped in. For a kid coming off the back of Resident Evil 3, this was mind-blowing. Seeing the lightning and flash and illuminate the textures of the wall in real time felt like we had finally arrived in the future. But that new perspective came with a lot of pressure. The atmosphere was incredibly lonely, even by Resident Evil standards. You weren't in a bustling city or a cosy mansion anymore. You were in a cold, isolated facility run by the Ashfords. A family that made the typical Umbrella executives look normal. That atmosphere is really what carries the opening hours. It's dark, it's moody, and it leans heavily into that gothic horror vibe that the series hadn't fully explored yet. Even the music felt different, more cinematic and orchestral. It's like Capcom was trying to tell us that the B-movie era of the 32-bit games was over, and we were moving into something much more serious. Of course, then Steve Burnside shows up and ruins that theory, but those first few minutes in the rain were pure magic.
Wait, don't shoot!
Who are you?
Huh? You're not a zombie. Well, great. Wait right there. I'm coming over. Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those
Shut up. Make one wrong move and I'll shoot.
As much as the new 3D look was a marvel, it didn't take long for the game to remind you that it was still a Resident Evil title at its core, only much meaner. Code Veronica is arguably the most punishing game in the original style. It didn't just ask you to manage your resources, it actively sets traps for you. We've all got that one memory of a game that felt like it was cheating, and for most people, this was the one. The most infamous example has to be the Tyrant fight on the cargo plane. It's the ultimate gear check. You've spent the last few hours scraping by, maybe using a few too many explosive arrows or health sprays, and suddenly, you're locked in a tiny metal tube with a monster that can end your run in seconds. If you didn't have the specific ammo count or the health to tank a hit, you were essentially done. There was no going back to an earlier area to find more supplies. You were just staring at a save file that you couldn't possibly complete. For a kid, this was devastating. It was the first time a game really forced me to consider restarting the entire thing from the beginning just because it wasn't optimal enough. Then you had the character swap. Crossing over from Claire to Chris halfway through the game is a cool story beat, but from a gameplay perspective, it was a total curveball. If you were like me, you probably loaded Claire up with every heavy weapon you had, thinking you were heading into the final boss fight. When the game suddenly hands you the control of Chris back at the start of the island, and you realise all your best gear is sitting in Claire's inventory, which you can't access, the sinking feeling in your stomach is real. It turned the game into a memory test. You weren't just playing the game, you were playing against the developer's knowledge of what was coming next. It's the kind of design that would never truly fly today, but back then, it gave the game a legendary reputation for being the true survival challenge.
Who is that? Alexia? No! She's already fully awake.
Chris, oh little fishy, come see my hook.
One of the biggest draws for Code Veronica was finally getting Chris Redfield back in the driver's seat. After he vanished at the end of the first game, he'd become this legendary figure in the lore. The guy Claire was risking everything to find. He looked different, he sounded different, and he brought a completely different energy to the game. While Claire's sections felt like a desperate escape, Chris's half felt more like a mission. It was the first time we really got to see him as the seasoned operative, even if he did spend a suspicious amount of time punching rocks and climbing cliffs. But the real shock wasn't just Chris being back, it was who he brought with him. Albert Wesker returning from the dead was a massive water cooler moment for anyone who grew up with the original game. We all saw him get impaled by the tyrant in the Spencer mansion, so seeing him alive and wearing sunglasses was a total trip. This was the birth of Super Wesker. He wasn't just a traitorous captain anymore. He was a full-blown comic book villain with glowing eyes and the ability to run up walls. Looking back, it's hilarious how much the game leans into the Matrix style. The slow-motion fights and the over-the-top dialogue between Chris and Wesker was so aggressively early 2000s that it almost hurts to watch now, but at the time, it was epic. It turned a survival horror into a personal blood feud. That rivalry became the backbone of the entire series for the next decade, and it all started here on a freezing island in the middle of nowhere. It gave the game a sense of weight that the spin-offs like Resident Evil 3 didn't quite have. It felt like the stakes had finally moved beyond just surviving a city. It was now about a global grudge match.
Today's your lucky day. Next time we meet, don't count on another.
Next time.
Until we meet again.
While the series had always dabbled with the creepy mansion aesthetic, Code Veronica took a hard turn into a very specific kind of gothic horror. It moved away from the cold corporate dread of Umbrella's secret labs and gave us the Ashford family. Alfred and Alexia Ashford weren't just your typical Umbrella executives in lab coats. They felt like they'd stepped out of a twisted period drama. Their home on Rockfort Island, with its velvet curtains, gramophones and dusty suits of armour, felt more like a haunted estate than a research facility. It gave the game a personality that was completely distinct from anything we'd seen in Raccoon City. Alfred Ashford is easily one of the most unsettling villains in the entire franchise. He wasn't scary because he was a giant monster. He was scary because he was clearly unhinged and desperate for his sister's approval. The way he'd taunt you over the loudspeakers with that high-pitched mocking laugh that made the island feel like his personal playground. Then there was the whole mystery surrounding Alexia. The game does a great job of building it up as this legendary, untouchable figure sleeping in a cryogenic tank, the perfect Ashford who was supposed to restore the family's glory. This shift towards the family drama horror was a big departure. It made the stakes feel more personal and honestly, a bit weirder. You weren't just fighting zombies. You were caught in the middle of a literal family meltdown that just happened to involve high-end biological weapons. It added a layer of psychological unease that the PS1 games didn't really touch. It was less about the jump scares and more about the realisation that the people running these facilities were just as broken as the monsters they were creating. It's that weird, uncomfortable energy that keeps the game's atmosphere feeling fresh, even when the gameplay starts to feel a bit dated.
Alexia, you're finally awake. Alexia.
You can't talk about Code Veronica without talking about the most diverse character in the entire franchise, Steve Burnside. If Claire and Chris were the anchors that kept the game grounded in the series' history, Steve was the wildcard that threw everything off balance. He was the quite essential teenager with an attitude, complete with the dual-wielding gold Lugers and a voice that sounded like he was constantly complaining about his chores. For a lot of players, he was the breaking point, the moment where the tension of the horror was interrupted by a kid who just wouldn't stop whining. But looking back with a bit of perspective, Steve serves as a weirdly important purpose. He's the mirror to Claire's maturity. While Claire is being hardened by the events of Raccoon City, Steve is just a kid who's been caught up in a nightmare he doesn't understand. His backstory is actually pretty tragic. His father was an Umbrella employee who got the whole family locked up for selling secrets, but it's often buried under his awkward attempts at flirting and his questionable decision making. He's that classic human element that Resident Evil loves to throw in, reminding you that not everyone in the world is a high-level STARS operative. The relationship between Claire and Steve is what drives a lot of the game's emotional beats. Even if those beats land with a bit of a thud sometimes, it leads to one of the most stressful segments in the game, where you're forced to run away from a mutated version of him in a narrow hallway. It was another one of those Code Veronica moments where if you didn't have enough health to tank a hit or two, you were basically dead. Love him or hate him, Steve represents that era of Capcom writing where they were trying to blend survival horror with a more cinematic, character-driven drama. It didn't always work, but it definitely made the game memorable.
No, wait!
One of the best examples of how this game rewards insider knowledge is the boss with Nosferatu. If you're playing this for the first time, your instinct is to unload every heavy round you've saved up. You see this blind, shrieking creature stumbling towards you on a frozen helipad, surrounded by a deadly drop-off and freezing fog, and you panic. But if you've played the game as many times as I have, you know that the proper way to handle him is almost ridiculously simple. All you need is a sniper rifle and, believe it or not, a combat knife. The knife in Code Veronica is notoriously overpowered compared to the PS1 games. It hits multiple times per swing, making it a legitimate strategy for saving ammo on a regular zombie. But using it against a boss like Nosferatu, that takes a level of confidence you only get after being beaten down by the game a dozen times. Using the rifle to hit his exposed heart from a distance and then closing it to finish the job feels like a complete 180 from the desperate spray and pray gameplay of the earlier sections. It's one of those moments where the game stops being a horror experience and starts feeling like a puzzle you finally solved. It's also a perfect example of the game's unique atmosphere. Fighting a blind, tortured experiment on top of a base in Antarctica, with the wind howling and the camera struggling to keep up with the action, is peak Resident Evil. It's weird and it's clunky, and it's incredibly satisfying when you pull it off. But it also highlights the reset wall I mentioned earlier. If you didn't pick up that sniper rifle, or you wasted your ammo earlier, this fight becomes an absolute nightmare. It's a game of high highs and very low lows, where your success often depends on what you did 3 hours ago rather than what you're doing right now.
Chris!
Hey, you know that I always keep my promises.
When the news broke that the Dreamcast's biggest exclusive was heading to the PlayStation 2, it felt like the natural order of things was being restored. For those of us who had stuck with Sony, the X version was our chance to finally see what all the fuss was about. But if you were expecting a massive overhaul, you were probably a bit underwhelmed. It felt a lot like the Resident Evil Director's Cut situation. It was more, but it wasn't necessarily enough to justify the hype if you'd already played the original. The main selling point for most of us wasn't the game itself, it was the demo disc tucked inside the case. Capcom included a playable slice of their next big flagship, Devil May Cry. I remember looking through the magazines and seeing this gothic, fast-paced action game and thinking it was the next logical step for the horror genre. I didn't even realise at the time that Devil May Cry had actually started its life as an early version of Resident Evil 4 before it went in a completely different direction. That demo was the must-have item for a lot of people. Code Veronica X was just the wrapper it came in. As for the actual changes, in the X version, they were pretty thin on the ground. You got a few extended cutscenes that gave Wesker a bit more screen time and explained his goals a little better, which was great for lore junkies. but the core game remains identical. There were no new difficulty modes, no randomised items, and no major gameplay tweaks. Even the new haircut for Steve was such a minor change that I honestly didn't even notice it back then. It felt less like a definitive edition, and more like content that had been cut from the Dreamcast version finally being patched back in for the PS2 audience. It was a solid port, but it didn't have that special feeling of a game being built specifically for the hardware. Even though the PS2 version had the extra cutscenes and the flashy demo, I've always found myself gravitating back to the Dreamcast. There is just a specific feeling to playing it on Sega's hardware that the port couldn't quite replicate. Part of it is definitely the convenience of the VMU. Having your health status right there on the controller screen meant you didn't have to keep pausing the game to check if you were in the caution or danger zone. It kept you in the moment, making the experience feel a bit more seamless and high-tech for the time. But it's also the physical presence of the console itself. The Dreamcast has this heavy mechanical personality. Between the loud spin of the disc and the distinct beep when you power it on, it feels like you're operating a piece of machinery rather than just playing a game. For me, that's all tied up in the nostalgia of being 10 years old and seeing those graphics for the first ever time. It was a leap that felt so significant that it stayed burnt into my memory, no matter how many times I play the HD remaster or the PS2 port. It never quite matches that feeling of sitting in front of the Dreamcast in the early 2000s. It's that connection to the era that makes the game so special. It's not the most polished Resident Evil, and it's certainly not the easiest, but it's the one that feels the most like a bridge between the two generations of horror. It took everything we loved about the PS1 trilogy and tried to scale it up for a new century. It didn't always get it right, but the ambition behind it was undeniable, even with its flaws. It's a game that stays with you, long after you finally put that last tyrant to rest.
Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
I'm sorry, Claire, but it's not over yet. There's still something we've got to do.
You mean...
Yeah, it's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all!
Looking at the track record of Capcom lately, it's impossible not to think about what a modern version of this game would look like. We've seen the heavy hitters like Resident Evil 2 and 4 get their time in the spotlight, and they were incredible, but Code Veronica is actually the game that needs it the most. It's the entry that has the biggest gap between its brilliant ideas and its clunky execution. There is so much potential in the story of Rockfort Island and the Ashford family that a modern lens really could turn into something special. A remake could finally fix those restart walls that ruined so many runs back in the day. Imagine a version of the Tyrant plane fight or the Nosferatu battle that felt fair but still terrifyingly tense. They could flesh out the character of Steve Burnside to make him more than just a diversive teenager. They could lean even harder into that gothic psychological horror that made the original stand out. It's a game with so much soul and so many memorable locations, from the frozen wastes of Antarctica to the creepy Ashford estate, and seeing those recreated with today's tech would be a dream come true for fans who grew up with the original. Out of all the classics, this is the one that would benefit most from a complete ground-up redesign. It has the scale, it has the villains, and it has that personal connection for so many of us who remember the jump from the 32-bit era. It's the missing link in the modern remake series, and honestly, it's the one I'm most excited about potentially seeing again. It would be the perfect way to give this difficult, beautiful, and deeply flawed masterpiece the second chance it deserves.
I'm sorry. I failed you.
Moving forward with these reflections is about more than just checking titles off a list. It's about tracing the entire history of a series I've lived with since the very beginning. We're going to be moving through these games in release order, from the first time I stepped into the Spencer Mansion in 1996, all the way to the latest releases in 2026 with Requiem. It's a chance to look back at the high points, the inevitable declines, and even the absolute stinkers that tried to capitalise on the name. The goal is to capture that feeling of growing up alongside the franchise, experiencing the shifts in tech, the changes in tone, and the moments that define survival horror for a whole generation. We've survived the main story of Code Veronica, but the early 2000s were a weird time for the series, and Capcom was experimenting with some truly strange ways to keep their brands alive outside the main numbered entries. Next time, we're staying in this era, but we're heading into a completely different direction. We're looking at Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. It's an arcade-style shooter that eventually found its way onto the PS2, and it's a perfect example of how the series started to branch out in ways we definitely didn't see coming. It's going to be a strange one, but that's all part of the journey.
What? No!
Wait a second. What just happened?